what I want to talk a little bit about, I think, how many were there last night? So the basic idea of what I said last night, using the example of Saigatsu, which has emerged into this incredibly productive food system transformation process organized around the cooperative. But the basic argument is that consumers needed to start seeing themselves as co-producers and co-investors in transforming the food system. Land is obviously a part of this, and how to deal with the succession problem is a really significant issue. And there it is, I agree with Sally, there's no silver bullets here. But I do think, ultimately, you're not going to get out of this competitive kind of thing you just talked about in terms of Quebec. I don't know your name, but given if all the land is held privately and in the context of speculative mindset, it's just, I don't know how you ever really get at that. So to try and solve just that problem without thinking about it in a larger context, I think is problematic. We have to have a way of taking that land progressively out of the market and valuing it for the purpose of food. And you cannot expect, nor should farmers expect, to be sunset farmers. It is not responsible from a community and from a social and, in fact, global point of view. Now, that's easy to say, not so easy to do. Financing, of course, what I want to talk about, I could talk a lot about what's going on in the broader context in terms of the nature of financing, which tends to be predatory and has become more and more so. And what we have to do from a financing point of view is shift the model to a homeopathic kind of approach to financing, because what we're talking about here is how to intergenerationally do we transfer and restore and at the same time transform the way in which we go about feeding ourselves. I'm not going to go into this too much. I think everybody understands the way the basic system works. From private enterprise, you invest, you make a profit or a loss when the shares are sold. It goes on your balance sheet as an asset. You're basically credit. That goes on the balance sheet as a liability. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You understand how the basic system works around a business that is watching its capital appreciate, although you can also lose, and you pay out dividends and, in a sense, sell out your ownership share to someone else. So that's all this is showing. So this guy put in his initial shares, he appreciated the shares, he's got his dividends over that period of time. He's made some money. So, of course, in the context, generally speaking, and now I'm not suggesting that what we're talking about here is social enterprise per se, but what we are talking about is how in the financing equation do we reinsert social and ecological values so that they count for something, right? That is not so simple, because that takes a mindset, and it takes more than just a farmer and a financer. This is the basic point that we will see time and time again in terms of the models I just want to introduce you to. We have to broaden the stakeholders involved in investing in the transformation process of the food system. And that's a difficult thing for us to contemplate. Even people that really want to move it ourselves in that direction is sometimes difficult to contemplate. So, when you're blocked by the equity because you don't have a structure that allows investment to take place in a way that's, at least able to protect capital, never mind maximize return on it, you're left with grants and credit, and you leave at the starting gate, with a monthly cost that has to be dealt with in terms of payments and interest. So what I want to do is just talk about some ways in which, not necessarily just related to farming, okay, but some ways in which, some people have been thinking outside of the box and developing ways of mobilizing finance on a more local and regional basis to do things that conventional finance doesn't even look at, okay? So maybe there's some clues here that can feed into our discussion a bit. So I'm sure that how many people have heard of Sangudo? You're all from Alberta. Sangudo is about an hour outside of Edmonton here. It's a little village, like many rural villages in Alberta and across the country. It's been in decline for some time, losing population, boarded up, the usual kind of rural decline. And what they did is they started, once they were going to start to close the school, that's really when people started to, well, we gotta have to do something here. Like, this is just beyond the pale here. How are we going to deal with this? And they started to try and figure out how they were going to do that, and they started engaging in a broader kind of community mobilization process. They put in, park on a volunteer basis. They got people involved in a lot more kind of community events and arts and culture. They just took a systematic way of trying to kind of reconnect people even in this little village of 400 and move some projects forward. And then the big question, of course, is succession of businesses that have older people who can't work forever. And if they do, they're going to fall into their grave, and there's not going to be anybody to deal with the same problem, right? So they looked at a whole variety of ways that they might be able to mobilize some investment capital from within their own community, small community here, okay? And they decided on something that they ended up calling the Sangudo Opportunity Development Cooperative. So, it's a member-owned investors co-op, okay? That's the first thing. There's a maximum of 100 investors that are allowed. I'll go back to the allowed part, the regulatory part of this. The maximum they're allowed to invest is $10,000 each. And it's RRSP eligible, okay? So, this really got made possible by a change in the securities exchange legislation in Alberta in 2009, which essentially allowed for a simplified prospectus, right? So, any of you know about offering shares into the market? It's very expensive. A lot of professionals have to come into play, etc. This is much more simplified, basically a good business plan and with a declaration of risk, okay? So this was kind of an enabling innovation that allowed it to be tested, and this is the first test, in a way that would reduce the transaction costs, okay? Now, so what they had was an immediate challenge, because they wanted to invest in retaining businesses and potentially creating new businesses, but they were interested in business retention. So they had a custom meat packers, one part of the chain, small, local, retiring guy, wanted to be out, had it on the market for years, nobody was coming, So, the cooperative, they raised capital from 22 residents, and it's not that they were going to manage this. They actually had people who used to live in the community, a couple of younger people who were very enthusiastic about being able to have the opportunity, but they had the capital or access to it. So, but they recruited these folks. They were the right kinds of people to kind of take on this business, and there was a deal made with the owner and make sure that there was a good transition. And so what the cooperative did is they bought the building, right, as the first round, and then leased it back to the entrepreneurs, okay, as at a reasonable, quite low rate. And then they would have an option to buy it, right? So think about it from a business point of view. You're coming in, you don't have to put the capital down, you're not taking on debt. You are essentially getting a low lease rate because you have people that are interested in that business working, and you take a percentage of gross earnings. Okay, so that doesn't show up very well, but So really, there's a modest lease payment and a percentage of gross earnings, right? Which from the point of view of the business owner, is really a whole lot easier way to do it because you're, like you said earlier, you're paying it out of cash flow. You're not paying it, you know, where it's costing more. So essentially what they got is they got, the investors are getting 6.3% per year. Now, this is, it seems to me, pretty interesting. So you're only talking about a transaction here that's probably around $300,000, $200,000 or $300,000, a couple $100,000. But there's a transition process that's facilitated in it. It's got an interest that is based in the community that wants that business to do well. And it is RRSP eligible, so there's a tax benefit, right away for folks. Alberta, there's about $4 billion that goes out of province every year in RRSPs to Toronto or New York or overseas. And, you know, this is just one way of recapturing what is a personal investment, but putting it to work at the community. Now, I think it's an interesting discussion. Could that be applied, and on what basis, in other settings as one way of dealing with this transition problem? I think I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's worth thinking about because it does create the tax credit incentive. Okay, so that's kind of one idea. It's pretty concrete. It does mobilize capital, and I think there's some potential for being creative with that. Okay, 5 minutes? Okay, I'm gonna. This is a very interesting model. It's called withdrawable share capital. In other words, you can put capital in for £20,000 to $30,000. This is in the UK. Under the cooperative, all this is in the book, so incidentally. But the cooperative, or the withdrawable share capital allows you to put money in, but withdraw it. You only get a dividend, right? It may only be 2%, but they're mobilizing. They mobilize, like for a phone cooperative, they mobilize millions and millions of dollars, and people keep putting money in because they're getting kind of, you know, they're getting 2.5% rate of return, and sometimes getting a dividend when they take their capital back out, but they have the freedom to move it in and out, which is huge. So it acts like equity, right? And it's, you know, I could go into that, you know, with anybody. Huh? UK? It's the UK, yeah. And incidentally, this is under the initial industrial provident legislation passed in 1862. And it just went dead. And it's now being used to revitalize financing in a very convivial way that's much more able to mobilize finance. And there's another dimension to this that's developed, which I'll just show you. Okay, so they have another one here, right? So your maximum is £20,000, but they're using them for wind farms, for community-owned wind farms, right? So what you get is you get social investors, individuals, the cooperative movement, social enterprises, foundations, whatever. And they actually, in this case, have to put a lock on their investment because wind farm, you know, it amortizes, a lot more capital, you amortize it over a longer period, but you can mobilize millions of dollars into an investment here, right? And the rate of return in this particular case is excellent. Anyway, I don't know, I do want to go back to this idea of the land trust though. You know, and just very quickly to introduce the idea because I know, you know, that you've done this research that show that farmers really aren't interested in it because they want to maximize the value, right?
Or at least control the choice.
Well, yeah, okay, so let me just, here's the typical thing, right? Exactly what you were talking about, son, is development pressure. What you have here is an actual case, it's 23 acres, it's called Indian Line Farm. You know, there's development pressure on, they have an existing CSA, right? So this farm is one of the first community-supported agriculture farms, only 25 acres, yeah. And the question is, your retirement, how are you going to do it? You sell it off to the developer. what happened is the CSA mobilized and got in touch with the Conservation Land Trust, and together they did a campaign to essentially put up the money to buy a conservation easement, right? Which was the first money in the pocket of the retiring farmer, and it protected the land forever for farming, right? Then the land got transferred to a community land trust, so it's held in trust, can't be sold, except used only for farming, and a 99-year lease to a new farmer, which is bankable, and they can then buy the buildings and the equipment. That's the second round of money into the farmer's pocket, right? So they own the building, but the land is held in trust, which, in my view, is the way things should work. Because of the crisis we're in that Christie's talked about, I don't think there's a way out of it if we don't deal with the land. Anyway, okay.